The morning mist hung low over the grounds of Buckingham Palace, curling around the iron gates like a quiet secret that refused to leave. It was the kind of morning that felt heavy, the kind where the air itself seemed to know that something important was about to begin. The guards stood at their posts as they always did, still and silent, dressed in their ceremonial uniforms, their faces blank as stone. To the world watching from the pavement outside, they were nothing more than decoration, symbols of British tradition, men who had given up their personalities in exchange for a title and a uniform. But behind that stillness, behind those unblinking eyes, there were real men with real thoughts, and one of them was thinking about a woman he had no business thinking about. His name was James Whitfield. He had served the royal household for 11 years. Beginning as a junior officer in the household cavalry and working his way up through the ranks through sheer discipline and an almost unnatural ability to stay calm in situations that would unravel lesser men. He was 34 years old, lean but strong, with dark hair cropped short at the sides and gray eyes that missed nothing. His colleagues respected him. His superiors trusted him. And he had, until recently, believed that this life, this orderly, structured, loyal life, was everything he needed. Then Princess Anne had walked past him one Tuesday afternoon in the East Corridor. And something in him had shifted. It was not the first time he had seen her. He had seen her hundreds of times. She was one of the younger members of the royal family, known for her composed manner and her sharp intelligence. A princess who had been raised with the weight of duty on her shoulders and who wore it without complaint. She was elegant without being cold, direct without being cruel, and she had a way of looking at the people around her that made them feel, briefly, as though they actually existed. Most royals looked through the staff. Anne looked at them. That Tuesday, she had stopped in the corridor, not to speak to anyone in particular. She had paused near a window that overlooked the garden, and the afternoon light had caught her profile in a way that made James forget, for just a moment, where he was and what he was supposed to be doing. She had glanced in his direction, not with any particular expression, not with recognition or warmth, simply a glance, and then she had moved on. But something about that glance had stayed with him in the days that followed, settling somewhere beneath his ribs like a warm coal he could not shake loose. He told himself it was nothing. He was a professional. He had given his life to this institution, and he understood, more clearly than most, where the lines were drawn. There were rules, unspoken but absolute, about the distance that had to be maintained between the people who served the crown and the people who wore it. James had never once considered stepping over any of those lines. He was not that kind of man. Or so he had always believed, but belief is a fragile thing when tested by proximity. And in the weeks that followed that afternoon in the corridor, James found himself assigned more frequently to the areas of the palace where Princess Anne was likely to pass. He did not request these assignments. He simply noticed them happening, and he noticed, too, that he was not displeased by them. He monitored this feeling with the same detached precision he might apply to monitoring a potential security threat. Cataloguing it, measuring it, watching to see what it would do next. What he discovered was that it grew. Not rapidly, not recklessly, but steadily, the way water finds its way through stone. Not by force, but by persistence. He began to notice things about her. The way she carried herself when she thought no one was watching was different from the way she carried herself in formal company. Looser somehow, more human. The way she sometimes paused before answering a question, as though she genuinely considered the words before she released them. The way she spoke to the household staff when she needed something, with a directness that some of the older staff found intimidating, but that James found refreshing. She did not perform warmth. When she was warm, it was real. He also noticed that she noticed him. It was difficult to say when he first became aware of this. It was not obvious. She was far too careful, far too practiced in the art of maintaining composure to let anything show in a visible way. But James had spent over a decade training himself to read environments and people, to pick up on the details that most people missed. The slight tension in a shoulder, the fractional shift of a gaze, the breath that came a moment later than it should. And in the space of those fractional details, he began to understand that when she passed him in the corridor now, she was aware of him. Not in the way a royal was aware of a guard, not as a fixture, but as a person. This complicated things considerably. He said nothing. He did nothing. He continued to do his job with the same precision and dedication that had always defined him, because that was who he was, and because he understood with cold clarity what was at stake. Not just for him, for her. A whisper in the wrong ear, A moment captured by the wrong camera, and the damage would be enormous. He cared too much about her, he realized with some alarm, to allow his own feelings to put her at risk. But feelings, unlike guards, do not always stay at their posts. Meanwhile, deep within the palace, in corridors that the public never saw, and in rooms where conversations happened that were never recorded, something else was stirring. The relationship between King Charles and his wife Camilla had never been simple, not publicly, not privately, and certainly not within the institution itself. There were members of the household, some senior, some less so, who had never fully accepted Camilla as queen consort. Not because of any formal objection, not because the king had not made his wishes perfectly clear, but because emotion does not always yield to formality. The ghost of Diana still walked those halls in the hearts of certain members of the staff, and Camilla, whatever her official title, had never quite escaped that shadow. Camilla was aware of this. She was a far more perceptive woman than many people gave her credit for, having spent decades navigating the treacherous social currents of the British aristocracy. And she had long since learned to read a room with the kind of accuracy that would have made a poker player envious. She knew which staff members smiled at her with genuine warmth, and which ones smiled because they had been trained to. She knew which of the senior household figures considered her a legitimate queen, and which ones merely tolerated her presence. And she knew, with a certainty that had hardened over time from something painful into something practical, that there was a quiet but persistent effort within certain circles to limit her influence over the king. This had been manageable for years. But recently, something had changed. The change had to do with Princess Anne, or more precisely, with a conversation that Camilla had not been intended to hear. She had been passing the library on a Tuesday evening, the same Tuesday, though she had no way of knowing this, that James Whitfield had been quietly undone by a glance in a corridor. The door to the library had been slightly ajar, and the voices within had been speaking in the careful, measured tones that people use when they are being deliberately quiet, but have not quite succeeded. She had recognized both voices immediately. One belonged to a senior household advisor. The other belonged to Lord Haverfield, a man of old money and older loyalties, who had been connected to the royal household in various capacities for as long as anyone could remember. What they were discussing was a strategy. Camilla had not stopped walking. To stop would have been to advertise her presence, and she was too experienced for that. She had continued on, unhurried, as though she had heard nothing. And only when she was safely out of earshot did she allow herself to process what she had absorbed in those few seconds of passing. They had been discussing how to manage what they referred to as the current situation with Her Majesty. And the tone had not been respectful. It had been clinical, almost boardroom-like, the tone of men solving a problem, and the solution they had been moving toward, the shape of which she had caught only in fragments, but enough fragments to understand the whole. Involved using Princess and it involved, specifically, positioning Princess Anne as the informal feminine voice at the king's side in situations where Camilla might otherwise have filled that role. Not replacing her formally. Nothing that crude. Simply, gradually, making her presence feel less necessary. Making the king feel that his sister understood him, that she could offer counsel, that the household ran more smoothly when it was involved in certain conversations. It was the kind of move that left no fingerprints because it used affection rather than opposition. It used family. Camilla returned to her private sitting room and sat for a long time by the window. She was not angry. Or rather, she was, but she was also something older than anger, something more deliberate. She had survived things that would have broken most people. She had been made a villain in one of the most famous love stories of the 20th century, had endured years of public contempt, had watched herself portrayed as a usurper and a schemer, and she had come out the other side of all of it standing. She was not going to be managed out of her own position by men who met in rooms with slightly open doors and thought they were being careful. She would need to be thoughtful. She would need information. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs exclusively to people who live in the public eye. It is not the loneliness of isolation, not the loneliness of being unknown or unseen, but something almost the opposite, the loneliness of never being seen as yourself, of being looked at constantly, endlessly, by eyes that see only what they expect to see, only what they need you to be. The princess, the diplomat's daughter, the royal, the symbol, never the person inside the symbol. Never the woman who woke at 3 in the morning with doubts she could tell no one. Who found more peace in the stables than in any ballroom. Who had learned so early and so completely to present a composed face to the world that sometimes, in the quiet of her own rooms, she struggled to remember what an unguarded expression felt like, Princess, and had been aware of James Whitfield for longer than she would have admitted to anyone. It had begun, for her, not with any single dramatic moment, but with an accumulation of small things. The way he held himself differently from the other guards, not more rigidly, but more genuinely, as though the discipline came from inside him rather than from training. The way his eyes moved when she passed, not with the careful blankness of the well-trained royal guard, but with something else, something controlled, but alive, like a fire behind glass. And the way, on one particular afternoon, when a state visitor had made a comment in her presence that was insulting in a way that only she, apparently, had noticed, James had been the only other person in that corridor who had reacted. A fractional tightening of the jaw, almost invisible. But she had seen it because she had been looking. She had not been looking on purpose. That was what she told herself. She had simply been looking at the room, as she always did, reading it, the way she had been taught to read rooms since she was old enough to attend public functions. And he had been in the room. And she had noticed him. That was all, but she had kept noticing him, and the noticing had started to feel deliberate. Anne was not naive about what this meant. She had been around the institution long enough to understand its gravitational field, the way it bent everything that came near it into orbits that served its stability. People did not simply fall in love at Buckingham Palace. People fell into arrangements that were politically convenient, or they fell into disaster. There was very little middle ground. She had watched, from close proximity, what had happened when the rules were broken, when emotion had been allowed to exceed the bounds of what the institution could absorb. She had watched it happen to her own family, to people she loved, and she had seen the cost. The cameras, the headlines, the grinding machinery of public scrutiny. Taking private things and reducing them to entertainment for an audience that felt entitled to know everything. She had decided, long ago, that this would not happen to her. She had decided that she would be the one member of the family who kept her private life genuinely private. Not by being secretive, not by being cold, but simply by being so consistently careful that there would never be anything to expose. She had been largely successful. Her personal life was, by the standards of modern royalty, remarkably quiet. And she had managed this not by suppressing herself, but by channeling everything. All the passion and intelligence and feeling that was entirely her own. Into her work, into the causes she championed. Into the sharp and careful thinking that was her most reliable comfort. She was not, therefore, the kind of woman who was easily shaken. And yet, she had been in the East Library 3 days after the incident with Lord Haverfield and the household advisor. The incident she did not yet know Camilla had also witnessed. She had gone there in the early evening for the same reason she always went to the library when she needed to think, because it was one of the few rooms in the palace where silence felt natural rather than imposed. She had been standing by the window looking out at the garden when she heard the door and turned to find that it was not a household member or a secretary, but James Whitfield, who had apparently been sent by the shift supervisor to check a report of an unsecured window latch. On the south wall of the room, they had been alone in the library for approximately 4 minutes. In that 4 minutes, very little had happened by any objective measure. He had crossed to the window in question, checked the latch, confirmed it was secure, and been about to leave when she had spoken. She had not planned to. She had simply found, with some surprise, that she was speaking. She had asked him how long he had been with the household. It was a perfectly ordinary question. The kind of question a royal asked staff all the time. Friendly, brief, impersonal. He had answered, 11 years, ma'am. And then, because the question had been ordinary, but the silence that followed it was not, he had added something he had clearly not planned to add. He had said that it was the longest he had stayed anywhere. And there was something in the way he said it that made it sound less like a statement about employment and more like a statement about himself. She had looked at him for a moment. Not with the careful, polished look she offered the world, but with the direct, assessing look that was actually hers. And he had looked back at her, and neither of them had pretended that this was a normal exchange between a royal and a guard. Because it clearly was not, she had said, quietly. That 11 years was a long time to stay anywhere, he had said, equally quietly. That some places were worth staying for. And then he had nodded, professionally, correctly, and left the room. She had stood by the window for a long time afterward, looking at the garden and trying to decide what exactly had just happened, and whether it mattered. She concluded that it mattered very much, and that she was not going to do anything about it. This conclusion felt responsible and correct, and also, if she was honest with herself, impossible. The following morning, Camilla sought her out. This was not unusual in itself. Camilla and Anne had never been close, but they had developed, over years of proximity and shared institutional experience, something like a working understanding. Camilla was careful with Anne in a way she was not careful with everyone. Aware that Anne's loyalty was to the family in a way that was complicated by personal history. And aware to that, Anne was sharp enough to see through anything less than genuine. Anne, for her part, had arrived at a kind of reluctant respect for Camilla that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with observation. She had watched Camilla handle things that no one should have to handle, and she had watched her handle them with dignity. That counted for something. Camilla asked if they might walk in the gardens. The walk was the kind that looked, from the outside, entirely casual. Two women, one younger, one older, strolling through immaculate grounds on a cool morning, talking of nothing in particular. Anyone watching would have seen exactly what they were intended to see. What was actually happening was quite different. Camilla began carefully. She spoke about the household in general terms, about the challenges of managing an institution as large and as tradition-bound as the palace, about the way that change, even necessary change, always encountered resistance from somewhere. She spoke about the nature of loyalty and how it could sometimes be weaponized by people who claimed to act in the best interests of the crown when they were actually acting in their own interests. She spoke about this with an even-handedness that Anne recognized as the product of someone who had thought very carefully about what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it. Anne listened. She was good at listening. And as she listened, she began to understand that Camilla was telling her something specific beneath the general, that there was a particular situation being described in the abstract, and that the situation involved both of them. She did not interrupt. She waited until Camilla had finished, and then she asked one question. What was it, exactly, that Camilla needed her to know? Camilla looked at her for a moment, and something in that look carried a kind of gratitude, an acknowledgement of the directness, a relief at not having to continue being oblique. She said, simply, that there were people in the household who had decided that Anne could be used, unknowingly, to diminish Camilla's role. That they were not asking Anne, that they were simply engineering situations in which Anne's natural relationship with her brother would be leveraged against Camilla's position as his wife. Anne said nothing for several seconds. The garden was quiet around them, birds somewhere in the hedgerows, the distant sound of London beyond the walls. Then she said, with a calm that was entirely genuine and entirely terrifying to anyone who knew her well, that she had not been consulted about this, and that she would not be used by anyone for any purpose without her knowledge. Camilla nodded. She said she had believed that would be Anne's response. She said she had come to Anne because she believed and deserved to know, and because she believed, whatever the complications of their relationship, that the crown was better served by honesty between its members than by the games of men who thought they were managing it. Anne said she agreed. They walked back toward the palace in silence. But it was a different silence from the one they had walked out in. It was the silence of two women who had just, carefully, and without drama, decided to trust each other. The thing about secrets in a place like Buckingham Palace is that they are never entirely contained. They seep. They find the hairline cracks in the walls of discretion, and they move through them, slowly, until they have traveled further than anyone intended. This is why the people who ran the household had developed, over generations, a finely tuned sensitivity to atmosphere, an ability to feel a shift in the institutional mood before it became visible in any concrete way. It was not magic. It was simply the product of living in a place where information was power and where survival depended on knowing. Always, a little more than the person next to you. Lord Haverfield had this sensitivity, and over the week that followed his unsatisfying telephone call, he used it constantly, reading faces at formal dinners, listening to the quality of silences in meeting rooms, paying attention to who spoke to whom and for how long in corridors and antechambers. What he found was not reassuring. Something had changed in the dynamic between Princess Anne and the Queen Consort, something subtle but unmistakable to an eye as practiced as his, where before there had been the polite, careful distance of two women with complicated histories. There was now something harder to define, a kind of quiet alignment, a sense of two people who had found an understanding. He had not expected this. He had assumed, based on years of reading the family, that Anne's loyalty to the memory of her late mother and to the complicated feelings that surrounded that loyalty would make her, at the very least, neutral in any conflict involving Camilla. Not hostile, not partisan, simply uninvolved. Unavailable for use. The idea that Camilla might have gone directly to Anne, might have been direct enough and honest enough to bring it onto her side, was a possibility he had, in retrospect, underestimated. He had made the mistake that powerful men frequently made. He had underestimated the women. He sat with this realization for 2 days, and then he moved to the next phase of his thinking. He was not a man who was easily discouraged. He was a man who adapted. Meanwhile, in the part of the palace that did not concern itself with strategy or power, in the corridors and storerooms and staffing offices where the real work of running the household was done, James Whitfield was facing a different and considerably more personal problem. He had been contacted by his shift supervisor with a change in his assignment schedule. For the next 3 weeks, he would be rotated to the external perimeter detail, which meant significantly less time inside the building and, by extension, significantly less chance of encountering Princess Anne in any of the corridors or rooms where their paths had been quietly, never quite accidentally, crossing. He could not tell whether this was a coincidence or something deliberate. The assignment changes were explained as a routine rotation, and they might well have been exactly that. The palace ran on rosters and cycles, and there was nothing inherently suspicious about being moved to a different post. But he had spent 11 years learning to notice when things were ordinary and when they were merely dressed as ordinary. And this had the texture of the latter. He accepted the assignment without comment because that was what you did. And he reported to the external perimeter the following morning and stood in the cold and did his job with the same steady discipline he had always brought to it. But in the back of his mind, he was turning things over. He was thinking about a corridor and a library and a window latch that had apparently needed checking. He was thinking about a question asked without quite planning to ask it, and an answer given that contained, within its simplicity, something else entirely. He was thinking about the fact that he had, in 11 years of very careful living, managed never to cross a line, and that he was now, for the first time, genuinely uncertain about where the line was. This uncertainty was new to him, and he did not particularly welcome it. Princess Anne, for her part, noticed the absence. She would not have said, if asked, that she had been watching for him, because she would not have wanted to examine what that admission might reveal about her current state of mind. But she moved through the East Corridor twice in 3 days without seeing him, and each time she registered the absence with a clarity that told her, more plainly than she would have liked, that she had been more aware of his presence than she had acknowledged to herself. She was sitting in her private study on the 4th day when she made a decision that she then spent approximately 20 minutes arguing herself out of before arriving back at dot. She picked up the internal household telephone and asked to be connected to the staffing office. When she was connected, she asked, in her most professionally impersonal voice, whether she might be informed of the current assignment of Senior Household Guard Whitfield, as she had a particular patrol route assessment she wished to discuss with someone of senior experience, and she understood he was one of the more experienced members of the team. The staffing office told her that Guard Whitfield was currently on external perimeter rotation. She thanked them, replaced the receiver, and sat for a moment looking at her desk. Then she picked up a different telephone, the one connected to the senior protection officer, and asked whether it would be possible to have Guard Whitfield's assessment input sought for a particular internal security matter she was reviewing. She framed it as a routine procedural request. She framed it, in fact, with such procedural precision that there was nothing about it that could be questioned, nothing that could give anyone cause to raise an eyebrow. It was, technically and formally, an entirely legitimate use of her authority, but they both knew, she and the protection officer, that it was not quite a routine request. The protection officer, who was a man of considerable experience and who had been in the royal service long enough to recognize the specific tone of a request that was officially one thing and actually another, confirmed that he would arrange for Guard Whitfield to be made available for the assessment. 2 days later, James Whitfield received a message directing him to report to the internal security review meeting at the East Wing office. He read it twice. He understood immediately that this was not a standard security review. Standard security reviews did not request specific guards by name through the protection officer. He sat with this knowledge for a moment, And then he gathered his notes and his composure and went where he had been asked to go. She was there alone. The official paperwork on the table between them was entirely real. She had prepared it herself, a genuine assessment of internal patrol coverage at the East Wing windows, which she had identified as a legitimate gap weeks earlier and which she had been meaning to address through the proper channels. The substance of the meeting was real, but they were both aware, almost from the first moment, that the meeting was also something else. They discussed the patrol coverage for 25 minutes. Professionally, usefully, she asking questions and he providing genuinely informed answers that she noted down. He was good at his job, she observed, not for the first time, very good. The kind of good that came from caring about it. It was near the end of the meeting, when the professional subject had been more or less exhausted, that she looked up from her notes and said, in a different voice, a quieter one, that she had noticed he had been moved to external rotation. He said that was correct. She said that she hoped the change had not been inconvenient for him. There was a pause. It was not a long pause, perhaps 3 seconds, but it was weighted in a way that simple courtesy did not require. He said, carefully, that he was quite used to working wherever he was needed. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, equally carefully, that she thought that was probably one of his better qualities and one that the household didn't always deserve. He looked back at her, and in that look was everything that neither of them could say in this room, in this building, in this life, and both of them knew it. And both of them sat with the knowledge that it existed, and that it was, for now, going exactly nowhere. She thanked him for his input on the patrol assessment. He thanked her for her time. He gathered his notes and left. She sat for a while after he had gone, her hands folded on top of the paperwork she had prepared, looking at nothing in particular, understanding with complete clarity that she was in territory she had never intended to enter, and that the territory had no map. Across the palace, in a sitting room warmed by an early afternoon fire, Camilla was having tea with a woman she had known for 30 years. A woman whose social connections ran through the British establishment like roots through old soil. The conversation was ostensibly about nothing, a charity auction, the weather in Scotland, someone's daughter who had done something praiseworthy at a recent art exhibition. But beneath the pleasantries, information was being exchanged with the precision of a professional transaction, because that is what it was. Camilla learned 3 things from this conversation. First, that Lord Haverfield had recently had a private dinner with the editor of one of the more aggressively monarchist newspapers. Second, that a freelance photographer who had recently been hovering around a particular entrance to the palace grounds had been paid for previous palace-adjacent work by a media consultancy that had known connections to Haverfield's associates.